Just in response, Your Honor, they just filed this motion, but it's never been the state's contention that somebody's going to testify and predict what Judge Hall would have done in this particular case. What we can, and there is testimony, and already in state grand jury transcripts, which they've had access to for months and months and months and months, is testimony about the manner in which the plaintiffs in the Boat case were conducting that litigation, what they were expecting, what they had received from the defense, the fact that the defense had claimed that Mr. Murdaugh was broke. They didn't believe it, and so that's what ultimately led to the motion to compel. The motion to compel did not ask for a financial statement. It very clearly asked for identification of bank accounts and other sort of financial information with the intent to subpoena that. That was the motion that was on the table for the very week, just a few days after Maggie and Paul were murdered, on top of the fact that Mr. Murdaugh was confronted the very morning of the murder by his own law firm seeking missing fees. That's the temporal connection of those two events that then tie back to literally a decade of embezzlement that one question begets another, which begets another. To understand why these are significant, the jury has to understand that he had been stealing for over a decade, 99 counts to date, and facing essentially life without parole on these particular financial accounts, and that's the significance of what he was trying to prevent from being exposed. So again, I hear what their motion is, but I think this motion will be moot and ultimately will be resolved during the course of testimony because no one's trying to say what Judge Hall would do. The point is a little different. It's what the plaintiffs were seeking to do and what they had very clearly said to Alec Murdaugh and his attorneys during the course of that litigation.
To get information, they were going to file and litigated with Mr. Tinsley, very aggressive. He filed a bunch of motions to get financial information, bank accounts he could not have gotten because you're not entitled to argue about financial ability to pay until you get a prima facie case of punitive damages, and that's what we say here. So he could file whatever he wanted, but to say whether Mr. Murdaugh thought that was a real threat or not, what he thought, and I will tell you that it's not consistent with the state of the law, not consistent with my experience, and I understand, you know, the Attorney General has not litigated a lot of civil cases. I have, since 1986, been trying to get more than just net worth statements in a punitive damages case. Never have gotten it. The last point I'd make is this. His theory, and this is sort of, is that he knew the jig was up. So he went home and blew the head off his son and butchered his wife. There's not one shred of evidence there was any problems between any of them. There's texts, pictures, people that were with him the previous weekend at a ball game, video from that day with Paul and he having a good time. There is no dispute anywhere that they were the perfect family in terms of their relationships. No divorce, no separated, no left him, no nothing. So this is a fabrication, and they want to use what Mr. Griffin described as bad character evidence. He stole all this money, so he must have killed his wife and son. That is, and as he cited, there are at least 6 South Carolina Supreme Court cases. I may be overstating it. How many? 4? 4. 4 South Carolina Supreme Court cases disallowing, and judges were reversed, disallowing this kind of evidence. Now, if they've got some evidence that Maggie was getting ready to turn him over to the feds, or Paul knew about it and was getting ready to talk about it, or he'd been threatened by them, certainly those cases say that's when that kind of stuff can come in. But not this theoretical, we ain't got a motive, we're going to make one up motive. That isn't.
What I'm getting from you, both of you now, are you give me jury arguments. And you're arguing multiple motions simultaneously. Regarding the motion by the state for me to grant an in limine motion admitting evidence, that's what you're seeking me to do? And you in your motion, you indicate that the basis for this is for judicial economy, that there may be no precedent for the court ruling in advance of any testimony granting in limine the admission of motive as evidence during the trial. You seeking to have me do that?
Well, Your Honor, I recognize what the court's saying. I think the first issue with that was in response to the defense bill of particulars. And our response to that was, they essentially asked, they said, tell me what financial evidence you want to go into. And so we responded by saying, well, that's not recognized under South Carolina law, but we filed this particular motion.
I understand,
yes, sir.
I understand all that, but typically a motion in limine is a motion to exclude evidence.
That's correct.
Your motion in limine is for me to admit evidence. And what authority do you have for me to admit evidence through a motion in limine?
Well, and of course, in our motion, and stand by for me, Your Honor, just 1 second. I recognize that typically a motion in limine is to exclude evidence, but the cases that we cite and the language we cite in our motion, of course, is to prevent disclosure of potentially prejudicial matter to the jury, and of course is strictly conditional and subject to the actual evidence being offered. And so the point was to, because it's very extensive and because we realize that this case is different. As I've argued, this case is much different than any case we've ever seen because of the complexity of all these factors going together. And I think essentially what we were trying to do is at least get some sort of preliminary guidance, understanding that evidence will have to be developed at trial as to the admissibility of this. Now, ultimately, if the court is more comfortable with having in-camera proceedings as to the admissibility of evidence, then I understand that, and we can do that as the case develops, as we were talking about the other things.
Well, this will create a mini trial, given all of the various offenses, 90-something allegations. And of course, we also deal with the issue of res gestae, issues of matters that may be too remote in time, and the like. What I'm grappling with is your request for me to grant the in limine the admission of evidence. I frown upon motions in limine, period, because I don't know the facts. I do not know the facts in this case. I know what you all have submitted in your briefs, your arguments, and whatever you say is the case, the defense says the opposite. That's why we have testimony, and judges are to rule not based on lawyers' arguments, but based on evidence. And I am not prepared to grant in limine a motion admitting evidence, though it may be admissible under the same theories that you have promoted. I agree with the authority and the rule that allows for motive to be admitted in a case under appropriate circumstances. And your all's argument in the cases cited by the defense, some are remotely similar in facts, and most of them are dissimilar. Each case must be decided on its own facts and circumstances. I believe that the Siegel case is persuasive authority, U.S. v. Siegel, though in that case, very noted jurist who spent some time in our state was reversed by one of our noted jurists, Judge Traxler, on the same issue. But I'm not prepared to grant admitting evidence in limine. It must be done during the course of the presentation of the evidence during the trial.
Absolutely understand that, Your Honor. And again, I recognize that we were attempting to perhaps identify those issues and bring those issues because of the complexity of everything to the court's attention, and I certainly understand and recognize, and that's the typical manner in which we would do that, is to have those issues addressed as we move through the trial.
That deals with that issue.
Thank you, Your Honor.
That leaves a ballistics issue.
Your Honor, I believe at this time we can move to that. I'm going to turn the presentation of evidence over to Mr. Fernandez, who will call Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. State will call Paul Greer.
Then for the record, spell your last name.
My name is Paul Greer, Greer.
With whom you're currently employed?
I'm employed at the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, which is commonly known as SLED.
All right, Mr. Greer, for purposes of this counsel hearing, would you please just describe for the court your educational background and qualifications in the area of firearms identification?
Yes, sir. I received a Bachelor's of Science in Biological Sciences from the University of South Carolina. At the completion of my collegiate career, I began an internship at SLED in the Firearm Tool Mart Department. I was appointed as a firearms examiner, a forensic scientist in the laboratory in 2014, where I began the SLED Firearm Tool Mart course of instruction. This is an extensive training program that's conducted under the supervision of other court-qualified examiners. During that time and extensive period, I conducted many written and practical examinations, conducted many microscopic comparisons, and assisted other examiners prep their cases. At the conclusion of my training, I was then given a comprehensive final exam that included mock casework and was able to begin casework on my own after successfully completing that.
Thank you. And Mr. Greer, would you please describe for us the field of, broad overview is fine for purposes of today's hearing, but an overview of what firearms identification is and the expertise that you've developed?
Yes, sir. Firearms identification is a discipline of forensic science in which our main objective is to examine fired ammunition components in order to determine if they were fired by a specific firearm.
And are you a member of any organizations, or have you obtained any additional trainings or certifications as it relates to firearms identification?
Yes, sir. I am a member of the Association of Firearm and Tool Mart Examiners, which is also known as AFTI. I've been a member of that organization since approximately 2015. AFTI is an international organization that I believe has approximately 1,200 members of folks in the field who do firearms identification and tool mark identification. This also includes technical leaders from the academic world and also from other aspects.
Thank you. And if you would, please describe the process that you go through and the training that you go through in order to become a forensic firearms and tool examiner at SLED.
Sure. That refers back to that course of instruction that I completed, that approximately 3-year or so program, and where I conducted all the microscopic comparisons, looked at things on the microscope, test-fired firearms, observed cartridge cases that were fired out of the same firearm, cartridge cases that were fired out of different firearms, bullets as well. Learning about firearms, manufacturing process of those firearms, and how that relates to the range of conclusions that we issue as firearms examiners. During that time, I also completed those written and practical tests. Some of those tests include studies that have been conducted throughout the United States and worldwide to include consecutively manufactured bullets and cartridge cases. I've completed those, successfully passed those. At the end of my training, I was given that final exam, and also some mock casework in which I was able to complete and successfully pass.
Thank you. And have you had a chance, I know you mentioned you're part of the AFTE organization, AFTE. Have you had an opportunity to attend additional conferences and trainings that they would put on on an annual basis?
Yes, sir, I have. When I'm able or training is available, I attend their annual conference. That is a large conference where materials presented about new technologies in the field or updates, new procedures that may be coming in order to do things or arrive with different items. But I attend those conferences when able. I also participate in other training as necessary, such as our Glock Armor certification when I'm able to do that. AFTE also has other things they provide. Webinars, if I'm able to participate in those, I will take part in that.
And in order to become a firearm and tool examiner with SLED, are you given certifications and tests that must be passed, both competency tests and proficiency tests?
Yes, sir. Part of our quality control at SLED, SLED, the laboratory is accredited by ANAB, which is the ANSI National Accreditation Board. That follows the standards set forth by ISO 17025, which is an international accrediting set of standards. And we follow that, and within that we have a SLED quality control manual that requires before we're able to participate or be authorized to perform work. We are competency tested and deemed competent to do that. Also, in addition, each year we are proficiency tested to make sure that we are maintaining our competency.
Okay. Mr. Greer, specifically relating to the purpose for which you were called today, in describing the area of firearms identification, would you please tell the court a little bit about the methodology that goes into that, and whether that methodology has been subjected to both being published in journals or subjected to peer review? Would you please talk about that whole process and the culture?
Sure. Firearms identification has been around for years. During that time, there's been many studies that have proven the reliability of firearms identification. Those studies are published in articles through AFTE, such as the AFTE Journal. Those studies using a scientific method are published in the AFTE Journal, or Journal of Forensic Sciences would be another one that could be included. And those are peer-reviewed. Those are looked at by members of the academia or firearms identification, other examiners. Those are reviewed and those are published in those two journals for sure.
Do you know what year AFTE was founded, for how long this organization has been around?
I believe AFTE was founded in 1969.
All right. And discussing the methodology of peer review, you indicated that the journals, that the information that's published in journals, that's in fact subject to peer review, meaning other people in the field or folks in the scientific community are able to review it and analyze it. Is that your understanding of it?
Yes, sir. That's my understanding. They would be able to review the article as it's presented prior to publication, review what has taken place in that article or that experiment, and share their thoughts with that process. Those articles are then, peer-reviewed and issued in those journals.
These articles are not only information, but it's also sometimes and frequently an examination of some study that was performed. Is that your understanding of these articles and review of those articles?
That's correct.
In addition to the methodology and peer review publications in your field, could you please discuss the specifics of that peer review process and methodologies in SLED in particular?
Sure. As part of our quality control process at SLED, again, we are accredited by ANAB. We just received our reaccreditation. We're accredited every 4 years during that cycle, and we just received our reaccreditation. And that again follows the ISO 17025 standards. We also, on top of that, have the SLED quality manual, which we follow closely to make sure that we're adhering to those procedures. And as part of that, we have a firearms departmental manual that gives us guidance in how to perform our actual casework, how to perform our examinations with the evidence. In that process, in that quality control peer review, our casework at SLED is 100% micro-verified, and that means that another qualified examiner will look at the evidence, arrive at their conclusions, and agree or disagree with me. For those to be reported, that examiner, we will, if he or she agrees with my results, those will then be reported. The case file itself also undergoes a technical and administrative review process as part of the quality control and peer review procedures.
And as part of your in-house peer review, is that a blind review that is performed?
Yes, sir, that is.
And speaking of the organization, the accreditation organization, ANAB, is that an international organization?
The ANAB stand is in the United States, but they follow the international standards set forth by ISO.
Thank you. And then the second layer would be, so SLED itself, the organization, the law enforcement agency SLED is accredited by ANAB.
The Forensic Services Laboratory is.
And then beyond that, SLED Forensics has a quality assurance manual which is followed by your lab, is that correct?
That's correct.
And then beyond that, the SLED's firearm department has its own manual, is that correct?
That is also correct.
All right. Has the field of firearms identification been applied in previous similar situations?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, let's start with sort of the big picture, the broad picture. Where and how is it typically applied, this field of study?
Firearms identification has been around for years. Since the early 1900s, we have been evolving on firearms identification.
And it's used in court cases across the world, is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Specifically relating to your personal experience, have you been sworn as an expert in firearms identification in previous court cases?
Yes, sir, I have.
And providing live testimony for a trial?
Yes, sir.
And approximately how many cases was that?
I've testified in state and federal courts approximately 25 times.
Certified or firearms identification examiners have been utilized in, as far as you're aware, per your organizations, have been utilized in court cases across the globe. Is that your understanding?
Yes, sir.
I know you mentioned that this field of study has been around since the early 1900s. Does this applied science use the scientific method when applying, your information you gather and then your opinion that you render?
Yes, sir. It does follow a scientific method and approach in order to conduct our examinations.
All right. Could you please describe what the scientific method is as applied to this forensic field?
Sure. As far as applying a scientific approach, when we conduct our examinations or we're looking at firearms in the scientific method, one thing when we're working a case or if you're looking at it in this manner, you may ask, you form a hypothesis, are these cartridge cases fired by this firearm? So that would be our hypothesis. We would evaluate the conditions under that, do research, and then we would actually do experiment. In this case, in this example, what we would do is test fire that firearm using similar ammunition that we're comparing it to. We would determine our conclusions and arrive at those conclusions. Then that can be also applied to casework. If I receive a case, I look at all the evidence, look at the characteristics on that, examine the firearm, test fire that firearm. I've already compared those cartridge cases to each other and determined that the characteristics of that firearm can be compared to those cartridge cases, compare that, determine a conclusion. In order to determine, and then our peer review process kicks in order to determine whether that is reproducible or the repeatability of that scientific procedure. That's where our peer review process would come in. Another qualified examiner would come in and look at that, and if he arrives at the same conclusion, then that method has been deemed repeatable and reliable.
Thank you. In the 25 times that you've testified in both state and federal court, has your testimony been ruled admissible, meaning you could render your opinion to the jury?
Yes, sir, it has.
And were any limitations placed on your testimony in the 25 times you've appeared?
There were none.
All right. The field of this forensic field of firearms identification, could you please describe the quality control? I know you have mentioned some, but could you please describe the quality control procedures that are in place governing this body of work?
At SLED, again, we are accredited under the ANAB policy, which guides us under those standards in our quality control manual. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
What quality control procedures are in place, both in this field of study in general, but also as it relates specifically to how SLED operates? I think you meant, first of all, what's the international accreditation that SLED is, the forensic lab is a part of?
Yes, sir. That is the ISO 17025. So accredited laboratories around the United States, if they are accredited by ANAB, they are all working with those same standards that we are at SLED. They're all adhering to those quality control procedures. Additionally, those who are accredited under the ISO 17025 internationally are also accredited by those same standards and follow those same quality control procedures.
And in order to obtain that accreditation and more importantly, maintain that accreditation, how much, what's the inspection process, both internal and external? Describe
Yes,
this.
sir. For the ANAB accreditation, we have an on-site visit every 4 years where auditors come and examine our casework, examine our facilities in order to make sure that we are complying with the requirements set forth by their governing body. They review everything that we offer as far as casework, make sure that we're complying with our own policies and as well as theirs. As far as internally, we also complete internal audits each year where other departments will audit and make sure that there's compliance within each department.
And although redundant, please describe to us the SLED quality control manual that's followed in the laboratory.
Yes, sir.
Could you describe it? What essentially is it, and how do you follow it?
Yes, sir. The SLED quality control manual follows those standards that are given by ANAB. It follows that so that way the SLED laboratory has strict guidelines in which we follow in order to make sure that we stay in line with our accreditation procedures and policies.
And if you would, again, although I know you explained it previously, but please describe the firearms department manual that's followed.
Yes, sir. The firearms manual is a set of procedures that we follow as examiners in order to give us instruction and information on how to complete our examinations, how to handle firearms-related evidence and tool mart-related evidence. It also includes some terminology that we use within our case files. It gives us guidance to make sure that we are all operating consistently and within those guidelines of the quality control procedures.
And if you would also please describe the code of ethics that is applied to yourself and your colleagues within the laboratory.
Yes, sir. Each employee at the SLED laboratory, including myself, signs a code of ethics that we must abide by each year. And that is a code of ethics for the workplace in our forensic laboratory, and that is recorded within our quality control procedures.
An additional quality control procedure would be the micro-verification process. Please briefly describe that for us again.
Yes, sir. Before a conclusion is rendered via report, each examiner will examine the evidence, arrive at a conclusion, write those conclusions down. At that point, another court-qualified examiner will examine the evidence and arrive separately at their conclusions to create a blind verification. If those conclusions are the same, then the reviewing examiner will sign off on those conclusions so that a report can be drafted. As also part of that process, the entire case file and report are reviewed for a technical review and administrative review before the report is released.
And in order to become a forensic examiner with SLED, is that person required to pass a competency test?
Yes, sir. That is correct.
And you in fact passed that competency test?
Yes, sir.
And are there also proficiency tests that are required each year?
Yes, sir. We do take a proficiency test within our discipline each year.
All right. Please, we're going to talk a little bit about, but I'd like you to describe how the area of firearms identification is consistent with recognized scientific laws and scientific procedures. So I think you mentioned before, but is firearms identification, do you all operate under the general rubric of the scientific method?
Yes, sir.
And again, describe the scientific method and how it relates, maybe how it applies to the firearms identification, beginning with essentially a hypothesis or a hypothesis, and then proceeding along to where it becomes a theory. Could you please describe that process?
Yes, sir. You would look at your evidence, or in this case, if you're just doing an experiment, and try and determine a hypothesis. Are these cartridge cases fired by this gun, or are these bullets fired by this gun? You would do the research to determine what materials you may need. In this case, you may use like ammunition that you're trying to compare to. You would examine those characteristics to make sure that the comparison should be completed. At that point, you would begin your experiment. In this case, you would test fire the firearm. You would compare those cartridge cases from the firearm with each other, and also with those cartridge cases or bullets that are questioned, and arrive at conclusions. At that point, you would conclude your experiment, issue your conclusions, and open up for any discussion. That is similar to casework in the fact that's a very similar method as what we use there. For repeatability and reproducibility of that, at that point, that experiment could be passed off to others in the field of firearms identification or in academia to review and comment. They could use the evidence or the cartridge cases and conduct their own experiment with it and see if they arrived at those same conclusions. If they do, then that theory has been proven and considered reproducible and reliable.
And generally speaking, in the applied sciences, is it important that the test be as accurate as possible? The test you're trying to reproduce in the lab.
Yes, sir.
Is it important that it's reliable, meaning you can rely on the procedures that you're implementing and the results you're trying to obtain?
Yes, sir.
And is it important that it's repeatable, meaning you could repeat that same process, or your peer review colleague could repeat the same process? That's an important component of this examination.
Yes, sir. That would be an important component of the scientific process.
In addition to all the scientific method and the processes you just described, again, this field of study, this applied science, is it also published in journals and academia for peer review?
Yes, sir, it is.
And are you familiar with some of the literature out there, having reviewed it yourself?
Yes, sir.
Beg the court's indulgence. All right, Mr. Greer, thank you for answering my questions. I do have a couple other areas I'd like to ask you about, specifically relating to some of the criticisms that was referenced in counsel's motion, specifically 2 National Academy Sciences reports and the what's been referred to as the PCAST report. Are you familiar with those 3 areas?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay, great. I'd like to ask you, let's just go in chronological order if that works for you. Beginning with the first National Academy of Sciences report in 2008. I believe it was, well, tell me are you familiar with that study?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay. Do you recall generally what the study related to, the title or the area field that they explored?
The 2008 article from the NAS was an article by a group of researchers dealing with ballistic imaging.
Okay. If you would, and you have familiarized yourself with that report, is that correct?
I am familiar with it.
What are some of the... All right, well, Your Honor, at this point, before we go into the reports, having established a foundation for his expertise, we do request that Mr. Greer be admitted as an expert for purposes of the rest of this testimony in the field of firearms examination.
Before the defense proceeds with, you have some questions for him? You have voir dire for this witness?
Not on his qualifications, Your Honor. For purposes of this hearing, that he is certified, I believe, under AFTE. That I don't have any questions on his qualifications.
All right, he's so qualified.
Shifting back then, Mr. Greer, to the first NAS, National Academy of Sciences report. The test was conducted on ballistic imaging technology, and was it critical towards that field? The general gist of it?
Yes, sir. Your Honor, may I refer to my notes?
Yes, sir. We'll take about a 2-minute break.
Right.